Isabella stood at the edge of the ballroom, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The air was thick with perfume and candle wax, and all around her the soft murmur of silk and whispered gossip wove a net of quiet cruelty. She could feel their eyes on her back, their fans fluttering like the wings of spiteful moths. They were not whispering about her gown, or her hair, or her lack of fortune. They were whispering about the one thing that made her stomach clench with a cold, familiar shame. Her husband was ignoring her again. Alexander Ashwick, the Duke of Ashwick, stood beneath the glittering chandelier, his dark head inclined toward Lady Catherine Worthing as if she were the only woman in the room. His shoulders were relaxed, his smile rare and genuine. He did not look at his wife. He never did. Isabella watched as Lady Catherine laughed, her gloved fingers brushing Alexander's sleeve with an intimacy that made Isabella's chest tighten. For 3 years she had endured this slow, invisible starvation. For 3 years she had told herself that his coldness was simply his nature, that duty would one day soften into something warmer. But tonight, standing alone while everyone whispered, she felt the last of her hope begin to crumble. The Dowager Lady Barrington, a woman whose cruelty was as powdered as her face, glided past Isabella and deliberately turned her shoulder so that Isabella was forced to step back into the shadows. "Poor thing," she murmured loudly to her companion, "married for a scandal, kept like a forgotten portrait. One almost feels sorry for her." The laugh that followed was soft and vicious. Isabella's cheeks burned, but she held her chin high. She would not weep here. She had learned in 3 long years to swallow her tears before they reached the surface. Her gaze drifted back to Alexander. For a single, desperate moment, she willed him to look at her, to see her standing there like a ghost at the edge of his world. But he simply smiled again at Catherine, and Isabella's heart fractured along a seam she had been mending for years. Quietly, she turned and slipped through the French doors onto the moonlit terrace. No one noticed her leave. That, she thought, was the truest summary of her life at Ashwick Hall. The cold night air stung her hot cheeks. She gripped the stone balustrade and stared out at the darkened gardens, her breath forming small clouds of anguish. She had married Alexander because her family's name had been dragged through the mud by her father's financial ruin, and because the late Duke of Ashwick had owed a debt of honor to her grandfather. Alexander had fulfilled that debt. He had saved her from poverty and shame. But he had done it with such silent resentment that Isabella sometimes felt she had been rescued only to be imprisoned in a gilded cage. He never spoke of it, yet every averted gaze, every terse word, was a reminder that she was a duty, not a choice. Later that night, when the carriages finally rolled away from the townhouse, Alexander joined her in the carriage without a word. The silence was thicker than the velvet curtains. Isabella sat with her hands folded, her wedding ring feeling heavier than a chain. She stole a glance at her husband's profile, the sharp jaw, the proud line of his nose, the eyes that stared ahead as if she were merely a shadow. She wanted so badly to ask him why he had never once tried to know her, why he had let the world believe she was unworthy of his notice. But she had asked such questions before in the early months, and the answers had been polite, distant, and devastatingly empty. So she said nothing. She had already begun to learn the art of disappearing. The following morning, Isabella sat alone in the breakfast room, the long mahogany table stretching emptily before her. Alexander had already left for his study. He always left early. She buttered her toast with mechanical precision, her mind replaying the dowager's words, Lady Catherine's possessive touch, her husband's indifference. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, angry at herself. She had cried enough tears to fill an ocean, and not one of them had ever moved him. Something inside her shifted that morning, a small, painful resolve. She would not keep drowning. She would find a way to breathe on her own. It began with a simple, desperate act. Isabella decided to make herself useful. She had always been good with numbers, a skill her father had encouraged before everything fell apart. Approaching the estate steward, a kind older man named Mr. Finch, she offered to help review the household accounts. Finch was hesitant, but the Duchess's quiet persistence won him over. Within a week, Isabella was buried in ledgers and receipts, uncovering small errors and inefficiencies that saved the estate a modest sum. She did not seek Alexander's praise. She simply left the corrected ledgers on his desk, a silent offering. He said nothing about them, but one evening she noticed a slight softening in his tone when he asked if she had taken tea. It was a sliver of light, and her foolish heart, still aching with hope, latched onto it. Encouraged, she expanded her efforts. She visited the tenants' cottages, listening to their worries about the harvest and the mill. She remembered names, ailments, the ages of children. The people of Ashwick village, who had initially viewed her as a distant, scandal-tainted figure, began to warm to the quiet duchess with the sad eyes and gentle hands. She asked Alexander one evening if she might establish a small school for the village children in the empty dower house. He paused, his dark eyes studying her with an expression she could not read. "If you wish," he said finally, and returned to his newspaper. It was not enthusiasm, but it was not refusal. Isabella clutched that permission like a lifeline. The school became her salvation. She spent her mornings there, teaching letters and sums, her laughter mingling with the children's. The village doctor, a widower named Simon Aldridge, often stopped by to check on the children's health. He was a gentle, unassuming man with kind brown eyes and a quiet sense of humor. He never treated Isabella with the distant pity of the ton. He spoke to her as an equal, as a friend. Their conversations were simple and genuine. He lent her books, shared stories of his travels, and made her feel, for the first time in years, that she was not invisible. Alexander, of course, noticed none of this. He was too consumed by his own silent torment. He had married Isabella Hartwell because his dying father had made him swear an oath to protect the Hartwell name. It was an oath that had forced him to break a long-standing understanding with Lady Catherine, a woman he had admired and believed he could have loved. The resentment had festered inside him, a cold, bitter stone lodged beneath his heart. He had built a fortress around himself, and Isabella, with her quiet eyes and her persistent, trembling hope, had been kept firmly outside its walls. He had told himself that polite distance was the kindest thing he could offer. He had been wrong, but he did not know it yet. Spring arrived, painting the Ashwick gardens in shades of lavender and rose. Isabella's cheeks began to hold a touch of color. She had lost the haunted, hungry look she once wore. She still performed her duties as duchess at formal events, but she no longer craned her neck to find Alexander's gaze. She no longer waited up for him in the drawing room, a book unread on her lap. Instead, she filled her evenings with lesson plans, letters to her frail mother, and quiet walks in the rose garden, where the scent of blossoms was more comforting than any empty promise. Simon Aldridge sometimes accompanied her on those walks, at a respectful distance, discussing a new method of teaching arithmetic or a funny story about his old medical tutor. One afternoon, they were standing by the fountain, laughing over a particularly stubborn goose that had wandered into the schoolhouse. Isabella's laugh, light and genuine, drifted across the lawn toward the terrace, where Alexander stood with a brandy in his hand, having returned early from a meeting. He froze. The sound was unfamiliar. He could not remember the last time she had laughed in his presence. He set his glass down and walked to the balustrade, his gaze fixed on the figures below. The doctor was handing Isabella a small, worn book, his smile warm. Isabella accepted it with a sparkle in her eyes that Alexander had never seen directed at him. A sharp, twisting sensation coiled in his chest, something hot and entirely unexpected. He did not recognize it as jealousy. He only knew that he did not like the way the doctor was looking at his wife. That evening at dinner, Alexander was unusually silent. Isabella, accustomed to his silences, simply ate her soup and made a gentle remark about the school's new chalkboard. Alexander's fork paused midair. "You spend a great deal of time with the doctor," he said, his voice carefully neutral. Isabella blinked, surprised he had noticed. "Dr. Aldridge has been very kind to assist with the children's health," she replied calmly. "He is a good man." Alexander's jaw tightened. "See that your charitable works do not invite gossip." The words were clipped, laced with something that sounded almost like warning. Isabella set her spoon down, her heart stinging. For a moment, she wanted to lash out, to ask why he cared about gossip now, when he had let her be publicly humiliated for years without lifting a finger. But she had long ago learned that fighting him only left deeper bruises on her own soul. She simply nodded, and the silence that followed was colder than any winter. Weeks passed, and the distance between them grew, but this time it was Isabella who was retreating. She was building her own world, one where his approval was no longer the sun around which she orbited. She no longer flinched when he entered a room. She no longer searched his face for a sign of thaw. She simply smiled politely, excused herself, and returned to the children or the ledgers or her solitary walks. Alexander, confused and unnerved, began to watch her. He noticed the way she hummed softly while arranging flowers. He noticed the grace of her hands as she wrote, the gentle curve of her neck when she read by the window. He noticed that the light in her eyes, once so often dimmed by tears, was now a steady, quiet flame. And he noticed, with a growing sense of dread, that this flame was no longer lit for him. One rainy afternoon he went looking for her. He found her not in the drawing room or her chambers, but in the old dower house, surrounded by children reciting their letters. She was kneeling beside a little girl whose slate was smudged, her voice soft and encouraging. She did not see him standing in the doorway. He watched her for a long moment. The way her smile transformed her face into something breathtakingly beautiful. It was the smile she had once reserved for him in the early days of their marriage, a smile he had met with cold formality until it withered and died. Regret, sharp and unexpected, pierced his chest. He turned and walked away before she could spot him. Lady Catherine Worthing, however, had not forgotten the Duke of Ashwick. She had watched her former almost fiancé marry a penniless, scandal-ridden girl with simmering fury, and she had waited patiently for an opportunity to reclaim her perceived place. When whispers reached her that the Duchess of Ashwick was growing overly familiar with the village doctor, Catherine saw her weapon. She cultivated the rumor like a poisonous garden, adding her own delicate touches. At a garden party hosted by a mutual acquaintance, she spoke loudly enough to be overheard. "It is such a shame for poor Ashwick, married to a woman who clearly seeks comfort elsewhere. But what can one expect from such blood?" The words slithered through the ton, and within days, Isabella found herself met with averted eyes and frosty greetings once more. The blow came at a charity luncheon. Isabella, seated near a gaggle of society matrons, heard the whispers clearly this time. "Her mother barely receives visits, I hear, while she plays schoolteacher with the doctor. Shameless. And the Duke does nothing, poor man." Isabella's hands trembled under the table. The shame was familiar, but this time it was laced with a rage she had never allowed herself to feel. She looked across the room and saw Catherine watching her, a satisfied smile curving her lips. Something inside Isabella snapped, but not with tears, with a cold, final resignation. She rose gracefully, excused herself, and walked out of the luncheon with her spine straight and her heart frozen. She would not run. She would not weep. She would simply stop caring entirely. That evening, Alexander found her in the library, standing by the window, her back to the door. He had heard the rumors only an hour ago from his solicitor, who had nervously relayed the ton's scurrilous chatter. His first instinct had been a rush of possessive fury, not at Isabella, but at the implication that another man might have claimed her smile. But seeing her now so still and distant, the fury faltered. "Isabella." His voice was rough. She did not turn. "Your Grace," she answered quietly. The formality cut him. "We need to discuss these rumors." She finally turned, and her eyes were so utterly calm that he felt a chill. "There is nothing to discuss," she said. "I have done nothing to dishonor your name. Dr. Aldridge is a friend who speaks to me as if I am a person, not a burden. If that is a sin, then I am guilty." Alexander took a step toward her, something breaking in his chest. "I never called you a burden." Isabella's smile was sad and gentle, and it destroyed him. "You did not have to say it, Your Grace. You showed me, every day for 3 years. She walked past him toward the door. "I am no longer waiting for your love. I am simply trying to live my life. I would be grateful if you let me do so in peace." And she was gone, leaving him standing alone among the books, his heart a hollow, aching void. The following week, Lady Catherine's rumors reached a fever pitch. At a musicale, she openly snubbed Isabella, and several others followed suit. Isabella bore it with a quiet dignity that only sharpened Catherine's resentment. Then the blow that Alexander had not anticipated came. Dr. Aldridge, his reputation smeared by association, announced that he would be leaving the village to take up a position in a far-off county. He visited Isabella to say goodbye, his eyes heavy with apology. "I am sorry," he said. "I never wished to bring you trouble." Isabella shook her head, grief for her only friend thickening her throat. "You brought me kindness, Simon. That is a gift I will always treasure." They shook hands, a simple, respectful farewell. Alexander, watching from the window of his study, saw the doctor leave. He saw the way Isabella stood in the drive, watching the carriage until it was out of sight, and then the way her shoulders sagged with a weariness that spoke of yet another loss. He understood then that he had allowed the world to strip her of everything, her dignity, her hope, and now her only companion. He had stood by while others cut her down, and he had done nothing. The guilt was a physical pain, a heavy, suffocating weight. That night he could not sleep. He paced his chamber, the truth finally crashing over him in relentless waves. He loved her. He had loved her for years, buried beneath layers of pride and resentment, hidden so deep that he had mistaken its absence for simple duty. He had resented the forced marriage, yes, but he had also been terrified. Terrified of the tenderness she had once offered him so freely, because he had believed he did not deserve it after breaking his word to Catherine. He had punished her for his own shame, and now she had stopped loving him. The realization was a knife twisting slowly in his gut. He had lost her, not through cruelty or neglect alone, but through the slow, agonizing death of 1,000 cold silences. The next morning, Alexander Ashwick did something he had never done before. He summoned Lady Catherine to his study. She arrived, dressed in ice-blue silk, confident that she had finally undermined the unwanted duchess. But the man who faced her was not the reserved, polite duke she remembered. His eyes were hard, his voice a blade of quiet steel. "You will cease your lies," he said. "You will write letters to every hostess you have whispered to, declaring that you spoke falsely out of spite. If you refuse, I will not hesitate to reveal the truth of the broken engagement, a truth that will leave your reputation in far worse tatters than the one you have tried to weave for my wife." Catherine's face paled. "You would not dare." Alexander's smile was mirthless. "I have been silent too long. For years I let others wound her while I stood by. No more. You will do this, or you will discover exactly how far a duke will go to protect the woman he loves." Catherine flinched at the word, her composure cracking. She left with a promise to retract, her venom finally drained. But Alexander knew that public rumor was only half the wound. The deeper wound was in his wife's heart, and he had put it there. He went to find Isabella. She was in the rose garden, sitting on a stone bench, her hands folded, her gaze lost among the blooms. The late afternoon sun gilded her hair. She looked up as he approached, and the guarded caution in her eyes nearly broke him. He stopped a few feet away, his hat in his hands, his voice rough with a vulnerability he had never shown anyone. "Isabella, I have sent Lady Catherine away. The rumors will stop. I should have done it years ago. I should have stood before you and shielded you from every whisper. I failed you. I failed you in every way a husband can fail." Isabella's throat tightened. She had dreamed of hearing such words, but now they felt like rain on parched earth that had long forgotten how to drink. She looked at him, this tall, proud man who suddenly seemed so lost. "Why now?" she asked softly. "Why after all this time?" Alexander knelt in front of her, his head bowed, and for the first time in their marriage the Duke of Ashwick was on his knees. "Because I am a coward who let his pride devour his heart. Because I married you bound by duty, but I did not marry you unwillingly." He looked up, his dark eyes glistening. "2 months before your father's ruin, I saw you at a country fair. You were laughing, spinning in a silly dance with village children, and I could not look away. I asked for your name. I intended to court you. I had never felt such instant, terrifying hope. And then the scandal broke, and my father's oath bound me before I could speak my own heart. I told myself it was duty that made me marry you. It was never duty. It was you. It has always been you. I was too proud to admit that I wanted you, so I buried it beneath resentment. I made you pay for my own fear." Isabella's breath caught. The world seemed to tilt and rearrange itself. All those years of coldness, not because he hated her, but because he had loved her and been too frightened and stubborn to show it. A tear slipped down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of grief for the time they had lost and a fragile, budding relief. She whispered, "I loved you too, before the scandal, before the oath. I saw you once, riding through the village, and I thought my heart would never recover. When our marriage was arranged, I thought it was a miracle, and then you never looked at me." Alexander reached for her hands, his own trembling. "I was a fool. I looked at you every day in my mind, but I was too afraid to let my eyes follow. I thought if I let myself feel, the resentment I had built would collapse and I would drown in the guilt of how I had treated you. So I stayed cold and I let you drown instead." He pressed her fingers to his lips. "Isabella, I do not deserve your forgiveness. I do not even deserve your attention. But I will spend every remaining day of my life trying to earn it. I love you. I love you too late, but I love you with everything I am." She looked at him, at the regret etched into his face, the raw, unguarded hope in his eyes. The ice around her heart, which she had built so carefully, began to thaw. Not all at once, but slowly, like the first warmth of spring. She gently withdrew her hands and his face fell, but then she leaned forward and pressed her palm to his cheek. "I stopped waiting," she said softly, "because I thought you would never come. Perhaps, Alexander, we can learn to walk forward together instead of waiting at all." A sound escaped him, something between a sob and a laugh. He rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. She felt the tremors running through him, and she wrapped her arms around his back, holding him as she had always longed to be held. The rose garden wrapped them in silence and scent, a world reborn. In the weeks that followed, Alexander Ashwick did not simply declare his love and retreat. He learned to be present. He visited the school, sitting in the corner while she taught, the children giggling at the sight of the stern Duke learning his letters alongside them. He walked with her in the garden every evening, asking about her day, listening to her talk about the tenants and the ledgers and her hopes for a new library. He spoke of his own fears, his long-buried grief over his father's death, and the shame that had twisted his heart. Isabella listened, and slowly the stranger she had married began to become a man she could trust, a man she could love again, not as a distant idol but as a flawed, tender, real partner. One evening, as summer blazed into autumn, they stood on the terrace overlooking the valley, the sky streaked with gold and rose. Alexander held her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "I once thought this estate was my greatest burden," he said quietly. "Now I see it can be a home." Isabella leaned her head against his shoulder. "A home is not made of walls, Alexander. It is made of moments like this." He turned, tilting her chin up, and kissed her softly, a kiss that tasted of regret and promise and a love finally allowed to bloom. It was not a perfect ending. There were still moments of awkwardness, old habits of silence that crept in, but now they faced them together, with words instead of distance. And when winter came, and the village children sang carols at the dower house door, the Duke and Duchess of Ashwick stood side by side, their hands entwined. Isabella looked up at her husband and saw not the cold stranger of her lonely years, but the man who had knelt in the garden and bared his soul. She smiled, and the smile was no longer an offering or a plea. It was a gift, freely given and finally received. In the quiet of the snowy evening, surrounded by laughter and light, they both understood that they had not simply found love. They had built it from the ashes of a broken beginning, and it was stronger than any fairy tale promise. The waiting was over. The healing had begun.